Lightland, Chapter 2. Lightland. Lottie scampered after Umber as the bird bounced through the cornfield, squawking constantly. We'll get there in time, never fear. On we go, that's girl. Lottie studied the countryside as they made their way through it. Memories kept flooding back until Lottie felt like a bathtub that shimmered with water swelling to the very top. She had all her stories back now, she felt sure of it. In her giddy happiness, she called out a few memories to Umber as he moved ahead of her. I remember, she called, noticing a bee buzzing nearby. I remember when Lewis and I were 5 and we saw the fattest bumblebee ever. Umber, squawk! Buzzing on a patch of clover, and Lewis said, Bees do not sting me, ever, watch. And he put his bare foot down right on top of that bee. Well, bees do sting Lewis after all, Lottie panted, and he's allergic to them. His foot swelled to the size of a cantaloupe. Lottie laughed, remembering and launching into another story and another and another. She remembered all of them. Everywhere she looked, stories came to mind, places she'd been, things she's done, things she remembered, 11 years worth of stories. As she hurried on, following Umber, she almost felt as if she were watching the memories happen again and again. The stories were coming back to life in hazy, shimmery images. And as Lottie ran on, the visions faded, but the memories did not. They were sharp in her mind in a way that she knew would never fade. Everything around her looked more or less like the actual countryside around her actual house. And yet it was completely different somehow. When she called this out to the bird, he responded, befuddling, Yes, precisely. Nothing's ever the same twice, is it? Through the rows of corn, Lottie thought she saw herself, much younger, twirling in the opposite direction, carrying something. It looked so real, almost solid. She wanted to get closer and see. Slow down, Umber, she called, but the bird didn't seem to hear. The vision was gone when she looked again, but the memory was back. That was the day she caught her first fish. Lottie tried to keep up with the bird while she felt again how thrilled she'd been when the small speckled trout. It began to look dusk. The visions were difficult to see. Lottie fought back a yawn. She was getting tired. After all, in real Iowa, it was the middle of the night. Just when she was ready to quit the chase completely, the bird vanished. Psst, psst, now! And dropped like a stone, vanishing altogether. Hey! Lottie called, but there was no squawk in reply. Lottie hesitated, looking around. The sun was much lower now. As she squinted behind her and realized that she had no idea where she was, the ground beneath her shook and fell away. Now Lottie was the one to drop like a stone. She opened her eyes and landed with a pleasant thump into a soft, puffy something. It was an armchair, deep red velvet with enormous cushions, wonderfully comfortable, except for a lump beneath her. Squawk! Umber wriggled out from under her, and now Lottie sank even deeper into the velvety cushions. She peered around in amazement. She was in a cozy little stone room. The masonry walls were lined with shelves and shelves of books. There was a quiet, crackling fire in the blue stone fireplace. Strange words were carved in stone. There were 10 or 12 enormous velvety armchairs of different deep colors arranged around the fire. Each chair, like Lottie's, was soft and cushiony enough to sleep in, and in fact, most of the chairs, someone was sleeping. In one, an old man with a long white beard was snoring softly. In another, a litter of kittens slept sprawled all over their fat mother cat. In the emerald green chair, a woman with glowing yellow hair sat reading an old leather-bound book. There were several arched doorways which seemed to lead to long tunnels with lit orange lanterns. It's too late now, the bird announced in a whisper. Too bad, but you'll be back. Oh, yes. He happily nestled down in the arm of Lottie's chair. Save for tonight. We can wait another day now that we've come. Next time, you must be earlier, sunrise. It's going to work. I'm certain of it. He tucked his head under his wing, and Lottie heard him contentedly. Hold on, Lottie whispered at him. What is this place? Who are they? I don't remember any of them. Why are they here? She gestured towards the sleepers. The bird chuckled. Lightland, not just for you. In fact, it's the opposite. You are for it. I am for it? Precisely. I waited long. Then I saw the tree, of course. Now go to sleep. Sleep until next time. The bird clucked and hissed under its breath and put its head under its wing. Lottie forgot to whisper. I just can't go to sleep. I want to know who they are. Umber tried to shush her, but the woman with the glowing yellow hair was watching them now. It's nightfall. Didn't you notice? Umber was exasperated. We took too long. One more day. We can wait. Don't you know this story, Lottie Cook? Lottie shook her head, and the bird whispered loudly in her ear. The Night King. Lottie's face remained blankly puzzled. Umber looked nervously around the room, cocked his head at the woman, watching them in great interest. Darkness belongs to him. He prowls, looking for sleepers. What are you talking about? Lottie scoffed. Some kind of monster, Night King? I've never heard of such a thing. The bird stared, horrified. But there is. He prowls. That's silly, like the boogeyman. There's no such thing, is there? Lottie stammered a little bit in spite of herself. The night is just the night. There's nothing different there. The bird laughed in a little sad way, and the yellow-haired woman sighed. You've brought her after all this time? She finally asked the bird, who nodded. Squawk! And yours are long. Perhaps you were right then, Umber. Well done. She called me, at last, long last the sign, the bird rattled on. Umber was faithful, my dear. He believed in you. We've all hoped, waited, but Umber most of all. The bird blushed a deep violet color. Almost gave up, didn't. But this story, the long story, the woman said to Lottie, you know it, don't you? Lottie shook her head. Let her talk to Robert, the woman announced definitively. Let Robert explain about Lightland. Oh, it's not nice to bother poor Robert, should we? The woman closed her book completely and gave Umber a sharp look. The bird fretted as he hopped over to the chocolate-brown armchair. There was a pair of feet dangling over the side of a low, rumbling snore coming from the cushions. The bird landed on the shoes and chirped softly. Robert, sorry to bother you. Won't wake up. Wake up, won't you? With a sort of shrug, he turned back to the yellow-haired woman. No use, is it? Then Lottie, he added. It's all sleep now for him ever since. The best thing for him. Robert, wake up, the yellow-haired woman ordered, and the feet wrangled in a spastic way. Robert, I'm talking to you now. The feet pulled back and disappeared as a messy mop of yellow hair rose from the cushions. A pinkish, sleepy face was beneath the mop of hair, and Robert yawned, long and loud, squinting. Lottie stared at him as he rubbed his eyes. His long arms and legs unfolded from the chair. He looked almost as tall as her father, but perhaps much younger, a boy, 16 or 17 years old, perhaps. Oh, he stretched and blinked achingly at them. Was it? Oh, mother, right? Robert, the yellow-haired woman continued pointedly, this is Lottie Cook. She doesn't know your story. Tell her the story, Robert. Robert grinned, scratched his head, tugged his earlobes, scratched more and scrugged. What's that? What story? The bird seemed deeply troubled by Robert's predicament. No matter. He hopped to the woman's chair and pecked at her hand. She didn't flinch. She kept gazing on Robert. Your story, Robert. You know who you are, where you came from, that sort of thing. The woman prodded, but her face looked pained. Robert grinned sheepishly. Who I am. Right. Sorry. He turned to Lottie. I'm Robert. Lottie smiled back at him and wondered what the point of this was, but the woman persisted. Go on, Robert. What else do you remember? Well, I'm Robert, and there's my mother. Robert looked very pleased with himself. The woman smiled in the saddest way possible. That's right, dear. I know you're sleepy, but is there anything else? Robert smiled happily and yawned. Nothing important. He closed his eyes and sank back into the chocolate chair until once again only his shoes were visible. The rumbling snoring started up almost instantly. The bird hissed and tutted. Poor Robert. Woke him up for that. Remember the old Robert? Tell a story. Couldn't keep him quiet, could we? Yes, I still remember. But we are the only ones who do, the woman said softly and turned her gaze on Lottie. It's been years now since Robert thought he knew better and stayed out past nightfall. He thought he could get away with it. He greeted us up above at dawn, boasting of seeing the stars. He said he'd slept in trees and woke with the dew in his hair, heard owls, nightingales, bragged about the moonflowers, lightning bugs, he said, flies that light up in the dark. Fireflies, the bird shook his head. Bats! Umber and the woman laughed in a wistful way. He was so furious when we didn't believe him. He swore he'd prove us wrong, bringing back fireflies for us all to see. But the next dawn, he didn't greet us. We discovered him asleep in a tree like this, his memory gone. The woman looked toward her son. What happened? Lottie asked, staring at Robert's dangling feet. The Night King had found him. This is what the Night King does, the woman sighed and stared helplessly at her hands in her lap. The Night King doesn't sleep. Umber was agitated. Never. At nightfall he prowls, captures the foolish like Robert. Captures? But Lottie shook her head. She didn't understand. Robert couldn't have been captured when he was right here. With his veil, he captures their memories, their inspirations, every significant thought. The woman continued as Umber nodded. After capture, they no longer remember anything important, and then, well, it's just a matter of time until they won't remember themselves, you see. To forget is to be forgotten, and in Lightland, to be forgotten is to disappear. Here below, we try to remember the old Robert, but daily the memory slips away more and more until... The bird shook his feathered head more ferociously. She needs to know, Umber. Until he'll vanish, he'll be lost to the oblivion. Existence worse than death, oblivion. Lottie squirmed uncomfortably. My Robert has been very unlucky, very lucky. We protect him here in the night room and try to keep him with us. Perhaps someday there will be hope for Robert, for others like him. Lottie Cook! Umber hopes that you may be able to help, my dear. Me? But how? Why me? Cherry tree, Umber nodded. He and the woman exchanged looks. Lottie wrinkled her forehead. Nothing they said made sense to her. What could she possibly do to help Robert? She glanced around the small room once again. You all live here underground all the time? No, Lottie Cook. In the daylight, we're safe above. When the sun is up, the Night King is quiet, they say. He enters a trance. Usually, living this way, we manage to evade him before he takes dozens of victims each night. Where are those people? The other ones he captured, Lottie asked, shivering. She curled up in her red armchair and hugged her knees. Somehow she felt safer in the velvety softness. Gone? Forgotten? Oblivion? Umber reveled. Their voices may still echo in his fortress, a part of his collection. I imagine some may be guarded the way we guard Robert. Lottie shook her head. But why would anyone want to? It is said that the Night King has no memory of his own, the woman interrupted. Its essence of evil power, emptiness. He is an empty void, a vacuum in space, prowling at night in search of souls he can absorb. Where did he come from? Lottie asked. The woman shook her head. That knowledge has been captured. He controls the reach of our memories by stealing years from our history. We no longer know what happened before. Our memories are hemmed in fear by the distraction, the woman said, watching her son sleep. While we use our own memories to guard Robert, we don't have full strength. We can't go on this way much longer. Lightland is suffering. Lottie found herself shaking her head. You don't believe, my dear. Well, it's also, I don't know. She frowned. Was it always called Lightland, even when you weren't afraid of the dark? The woman nodded. Remembering creates this world, as surely as daylight illuminates it. Oblivion would destroy it as surely as darkness overtakes light. She gestured toward the words carved into the blue stone of the mantle. Nunc lux, munc nox. Now it is light. Suddenly it's night. Lottie didn't understand a word of it. She brought back with another yawn. She's tired. Squawk. Let her squeak. She'll return. Now she knows the way. Yes, Lottie Cook, the woman said in a fond voice. Nothing more will happen tonight. Sleep, dream, and you'll find yourself at home. But come back. There's much to do here, Lottie Cook, Umber squawked importantly. Lottie was desperately tired, but found herself strangely anxious. Not that she actually believed all this about the Night King, but still, is it safe to sleep? So you believe, the woman smiled. Lottie felt her cheeks turn red and hot. Oh, yes, of course, my dear, the woman continued, obviously pleased. It is safe to sleep here below. These night rooms were carved out after the Night King first came to power. We were all forced below ground, and these caverns and tunnels were built in secret all across the Great Valley. Everyone in Lightland went into hiding except his creatures. The rats and mice, most of them, Umber rattled. In those early times, we hid day and night. We didn't know the limits of his terror. The woman's voice went soft on with the story of the Night King. The soft, velvety chair, the warmth of the fire, the gently lit room. However hard she tried to resist it, Lottie's eyelids were too heavy to keep open, her arms too heavy to stir. She felt the small stone of a cherry seed in her hand. Lottie began to sink into a warm, deep sleep, still hearing the voices fluttering around her. Squawk! She didn't know the story. Thought one of them would have told her. And now she's barely heard half of it. The cherry tree, that was the sign. When I saw it, I knew. The smell of blossoms, the swirl of branches. Lottie saw them all again in her mind. The rediscovered memories mingled around her tree as she drifted into a dream. And Lottie Cook was asleep. Chapter 3. Lewis's Essay. Mr. Cook couldn't wake Lottie for school in the morning. He had overslept a little himself. His ankle still hurt, and he didn't climb all the way up to her ladder. When Lottie barely shifted on her pillow, he mumbled, 5 minutes, Lottie, then breakfast. He saw the story box peeking out from under her head in her sleep. Lottie's hands reached under her pillow to hold onto it. He hovered there for a minute, beaming at his daughter and wondering if he dared ask any questions. Probably not, he thought to himself, and shuffled off to take care of corn muffins out of the oven. He gave her a full half an hour before trying again. Lottie, Lottie, it's getting late. Lottie only murmured in the quietest way, and Mr. Cook had to smile again. He let her sleep, not that he had much choice in the matter. By this time, Lewis was in the kitchen helping himself to a still warm corn muffin and wondering where everyone was. Usually he was the one running late. Lewis, is that you? Mr. Cook called, and Lewis smiled to himself, shaking his head. Who else would it be? Lewis thought. Of course he didn't answer. Isn't today Friday? I thought you had speech therapy today, Mr. Cook called from the part of the house. Oh, right, Lottie told me. New teacher, nearly forgot. I'm coming. Lewis, hold on. Lewis just sat munching his muffin, leaving conspicuous corn crumbs all about the kitchen. The cook's kitchen was always spotless, yet no one had ever been seen mopping or vacuuming or washing dishes. These things just always seemed to be done already. Lottie and Lewis assumed that Mr. Cook must stay up late at night to do these chores. They decided not to ask him about it for fear they would ruin this very pleasant system. What if he suddenly wanted them to do the dusting? Mr. Cook limped slightly as he came into the small yellow kitchen. Lewis noticed and raised his eyebrows. Twisted my ankle last night, nothing serious. Lottie is still asleep. In response to Lewis's tilted head, Mr. Cook shook his, smiling. No, she's not sick, I'm quite sure. Just tired. It was a big night. We feasted. I imagine she told you the news. Lottie likes school. This new teacher. Why, I wouldn't be surprised now if she decided to wear actual clothes. I'll go wake her up. Mr. Cook trotted gamely off again, and Louis followed, leaving a trail of crumbs behind him all the way to Lottie's room. She hadn't moved at all. Her father called her name sweetly. He nudged her, smiled at her, and then climbed back down the ladder to the loft bed. I think I'll let her sleep. Missing a little school. Well, after all, she needs her sleep. I'll send a note. Perhaps she'll come in for the half day. Louis glared and climbed the ladder himself. He did not like going to school without Lottie. She would have to be quite ill before he would skip off without her. Being a little sleepy did not impress Louis as a decent excuse. He shoved her shoulder and tugged her hair. She didn't seem to notice. Then Louis saw the bright, shiny cherry wood beneath her pillow. He turned to make sure that Mr. Cook had left the room. He had. Lottie, Louis hissed into her ear. That's enough now. Then Louis pulled the box out from under Lottie's head. Lottie sat bolt upright. Her eyes popped open and she gasped. This so startled Louis that he nearly fell off the ladder. For Pete's sake, Lottie nearly gave me a heart attack. You know we're late for school as it is. You'll have to wear the same pajamas. You can eat on the way. Your father made muffins. But Lottie hadn't followed Louis down the ladder. She was still sitting in the bed, holding the box. There was a strange look in her eyes. She tilted the box slowly from side to side, listening to a small rolling, rattling sound coming from within. Lottie, Louis was exasperated. What is that? That, said Lottie quietly, if I'm not mistaken, is the cherry seed. What's going on, Lottie? Louis hounded Lottie the whole way to school. She kept yawning. Why are you so tired when you slept an extra half hour? They saw no one. They were very late, so he kept talking right until they reached the big double oak doors at the front of the brick building. Lottie had said very little, and she'd barely nibbled at her muffin. What's the deal with the box, then? Louis hissed as he pulled the doorknob. Lottie smiled and blinked at him as he finally clammed up. Lottie didn't mean to keep secrets from Louis. She simply wasn't prepared to tell him everything that had happened the night before. Not yet. She finally whispered to him as they walked down the hallway to the classroom. It's Friday, Louis. Let's see if you can sleep over tonight. Then she patted him cheerfully on the head as if he were a puppy, and they entered the classroom. Misty Avignon was reading aloud from an old leather-bound book. The class, which normally would snicker and point when kids walked late, didn't even seem to notice as Louis and Lottie sunk into their seats. Incredibly, the other sixth graders were completely engrossed in what Misty Avignon was reading. It was an old journal. It was Misty Avignon's old journal from when she was their age. It was about everything she knew. Lottie thought it was the essay she had to write, everything that had changed last night. She knew much more now than she had before. By the time Lottie had settled herself down and looked up, Misty Avignon had closed the journal. Lottie was disappointed and looked over at Louis to see if he was still awake. He was, and it was a good thing because Misty Avignon had turned her attention to him. The teacher smiled at him. Louis smiled back. Then she nodded. Louis, glad you made it here. Let's have a report on how you are beginning to prepare your essay. For a second, the class half expected Louis to speak. Then they remembered that this was Louis. Louis, however, didn't seem fazed. He smiled again and walked calmly to the chalkboard. Lottie held her breath. Louis took the chalk and began. Now, Louis knew how to write just fine. When he had to take an exam or write a book report, he had no trouble. He just didn't write to communicate, to express himself personally. He only wrote in the academic sense, so an assignment like Misty Avignon's was troublesome for him. It was both an academic requirement and a request for personal expression, communication. In his own mind, as he stood up from his seat that day, he quickly planned to write on the board and outline a list of factual information without referring to himself personally. For some reason, that's not what he did when he arrived in the front of the class. In the top right-hand corner of the chalkboard, he quickly drew what looked like a small explosion. The dashes and dots and squiggles that radiated from it were quite familiar to most of the class. These were the same sorts of symbols that Louis used to fill his notebook every day, but on a much larger scale. Louis took his time, his brow furrowing once or twice. The class was quite riveted. They only took their eyes off Louis when he simply had to sneak a look at Misty Avignon to see how she was taking this expression of Louis's essay. Misty Avignon wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning. She was just watching. When Louis finally stopped in the lower left-hand corner, he placed the chalk in the tray with a quiet clink. She nodded at him and he sat down. He had a wild, startled look in his eyes and glanced around. He shrugged nervously at Lottie. Well, their teacher said, turning to the class, what do we make of this? They sat silently, trying to avoid her gaze. Alice, suppose you were an archaeologist hundreds of years in the future and you stumbled across this. What would you think? Alice Atwell was a quite wisp of a girl. Certainly she spoke more than Louis, but not much more. She sat twirling her long, straight black hair, studying the board as if this were a math problem to solve. Alice was very good at solving math problems. Brian Good whispered loudly to Ellen Wolf. I think that I dug up some old insane asylum, Ellen snorted. Thank you for your opinion, Brian, Misty Avignon said without turning her head to look. We'll hear from you next. Alice? There's a change, Alice said simply. Alice stood up. She walked to the board and stretched her hand to the right-hand corner. I would know that this was the beginning, even if I hadn't seen him do it. She continued, There's like a big bang or something first here, and then the story moves this way. It's difficult. See the sparks dragging backwards? But there's a steady force pouring things along. Gravity or time, destiny, pulling everything along with it, leaving this trail along behind. There's a fortress, a tower with someone in it. See here? And this looks like the night with stars. I think it is a story like this. Once in a land of light, there was darkness, and something impossible happened. Though it was unbelievable, it was real. The tower held the secret, and then it was destroyed. After that, everything seemed different. It was destined to be so. Alice finished, her voice tapering off. Lottie was staring at Alice. In a land of light? Had she really said that? Alice met Louis's eyes, smiled, and then remembered who she was. She blushed, scurried to her seat, and became very busy looking for something in her desk. The class was dumbstruck. On the one hand, for just a split second, everything Alice had said seemed right. Now that you looked at it. On the other hand, well, for heaven's sake, it was just Louis's same old squiggles. How could it mean anything different? And what had gotten into Alice Atwell? Well, Miss D'Avignon concluded, looking pleased, her hands in the air. Who else? Right, Brian Good, you were saying? Brian Good appeared a little green around the edges as the class turned to look at him. He cleared his throat a few times and squinted at Miss D'Avignon. See, I didn't see that stuff at first. Brian stood up as if he were pulling a string at the top of his head. He slumped in the front of the room and looked at Louis's masterpiece. I think, geez, somebody worked a long time on this, and in the end, it was just sort of nothing, just a bunch of wacko scribbles. Again, the class sat stunned as Brian returned to his desk. That was right too, wasn't it? They looked at Miss D'Avignon, who was beaming. Well, Louis, two very different interpretations. How is that possible? Louis certainly didn't answer. The rest of the class squirmed, hoping that they wouldn't be asked next. Louis was glancing curiously back at Alice. The fact is, it's always possible, no matter how precisely we express ourselves. There is always this room for interpretation. The author, Louis raised his eyebrows as he was addressed, must decide how much room he or she wishes to leave. Louis Weaver, your abstract expression here has left a great deal of room. When you compose your essays, keep this in mind. There are many, many ways to tell the same story, and there are many, many ways to understand the same story. Louis frowned. Miss D'Avignon laughed. And they all jumped about a mile when the school buzzer buzzed, summoning the class to gym for physical education. Coach Hagler was waiting. Coach Hagler had always had it out for Lottie. He wasn't keen on comfort, and every time she came to gym wearing her fuzzy pajamas, his lip curled. "Pajama girl!" he bellowed as she walked into the gym. "No sneakers?" Now, Lottie never wore sneakers to school. She wore slippers. Nice rubber-soled slippers, but still. As far as Lottie knew, she and Coach Hagler had reached some sort of détente over the sneaker issue. He gave her unsatisfactory in gym every year, and she shrugged it off. "Gee, I guess I forgot them," Lottie tried to joke. Someone giggled. Everyone else coughed. "Step outside," he ordered Lottie back into the hall. The class was watching with interest through the double windows and the gym doors. Lottie fought back a yawn. "I'm keeping you after school today, pajama girl," he growled. "You're waxing the gym floor for me." "Oh, gee, I don't think I can," Lottie retorted, not flinching when he turned purple. In hindsight, Lottie admitted it would have been better just to hold her tongue. After all, she had years of PE with Coach Hagler ahead of her. "Looks like you've used up all the wax on your hairdo," she mumbled. The coach looked like he was going to explode. He raised his hand in the air, and for a second, Lottie thought he was going to smack her. Louis sprang out into the hall to defend her. The coach wheeled on him. "Back to the gym, Weaver." "What's happening here?" Miss D'Avignon had come around the corner. She... Nothing. The coach straightened up as he tried to sound calm. "I'm disciplining these students." Miss D'Avignon raised her eyebrows. "Really? Well, it happens these are just the students I need. You don't mind if I borrow Charlotte and Louis for a little bit, do you, Coach Hagler?" The teacher didn't really wait for an answer. She turned to Lottie around by the shoulders and walked her down the hall. Louis trotted along. The coach stood there stupidly for a minute, trying to think of something to say. "I guess it's all right." He huffed and went back into the gym. The entire class had their faces pressed against the windows. He knocked most of them over on his way inside. "Were you really coming to get us?" Lottie asked as their teacher walked briskly ahead of them down the hall. "Certainly I was. I need you to fill out some of the forms we completed this morning before your late arrival." They reached room 11 and went back inside. The form was very brief. They could have easily done it at lunch or recess. Lottie and Louis looked at each other and wondered the same thing. Why had Miss D'Avignon rescued them? "Now, Charlotte, suppose you tell me what you've done to make Coach Hagler so disagreeable." "It isn't my fault he hates me." Lottie told her teacher about the mistreatment she had suffered in gym ever since their first grade. She told him how Coach had used her as a target to teach dodgeball, how he called her pajama girl, how he made her run extra laps because she was slow in slippers. He gave her detention if he ever caught her in the halls, even if she had a pass to go to the bathroom. Miss D'Avignon really listened. Not like an ordinary adult who nods and waits for her own turn to talk. She was interested. Talking this way made Lottie feel better. In my whole life, no one has ever been so mean to me as Coach Hagler, Lottie finished. Charlotte, it would be irresponsible if I did not point out that your remark to him was completely inappropriate. Honestly, floor wax. It wasn't until much later that Lottie realized she hadn't told Misty Avignon anything about the floor wax. How had she known? After school, they walked to Lewis's small brown house. Lottie still wasn't saying much. After dark, she whispered with a mysterious smile. I'll tell you everything. They went in through the kitchen door. Mrs. Weaver was whipping egg whites. The old-fashioned mixmaster was so loud that she didn't even hear them come in. Mrs. Weaver! Mrs. Weaver! Lottie yelled. Startled, Mrs. Weaver raised the spinning beaters, and the frothy meringue splattered all over Lewis. His mother was not amused. What do you think you're doing? She fussed. And shut that door. Heat isn't cheap, you know. They shut the door and didn't bother arguing that it was warmer outside on a sunny September day. While Lewis silently washed off the egg whites, Lottie asked if he could sleep over at her house. Mrs. Weaver scowled and went back to her recipe without answering. Lewis dried his face on the dish towel. You go find Biscuit first and bring her in before you go anywhere, she muttered, and turned the mixmaster back on. Biscuit was Mrs. Weaver's cat, and she hated Lewis. It was mutual. This cat had scratched and bitten him more times than he could count. She was supposed to be a house cat, but was forever slipping outside and getting lost. She was a singy, smoky color and could hide in the shadows right under your nose. Lewis and Lottie scrambled through Lewis's backyard, hissing and clacking sticks together, but there was no sign of the cat. The Weavers' backfield was a mess of rocks and rubble. They had never been farmers, and the place was overgrown and wild. Lewis sat on the corner of the dilapidated stone wall and took off his shoe. There was a pebble in it. Suddenly, a smoky gray paw shot out from the shadows and scratched its leg. Ow, gotcha! Lewis had caught Biscuit by the scruff of her neck. Lottie took the cat inside while Lewis retied his shoe. The pebble that had been in it was unusual. It had a groove in it like a chiseled line. Lewis slipped the strange stone into his pocket and caught up with Lottie, who was calling him from the back porch. She splattered with egg whites, but Lewis had her permission to sleep over. Lottie and Lewis spent hours after supper that night trying to get Lottie's father to go to bed. But he was dying to ask Lottie about the box. He felt sure that something had happened because she had such a glint in her eye. Finally, as they sat around the wood stove eating hot, salty, buttered popcorn, Lottie smiled almost shyly and asked if anyone wanted to hear the story of the cherry tree. Mr. Cook could not have been any happier, listening to the story that he knew she would remember. And as if in magic trance, he fell instantly into the deepest of deep sleeps right there in the rocking chair. Lottie was fidgeting with an unusual pebble. Lewis was fidgeting with the unusual pebble in his pocket. All right, Lottie, he said. It's dark. Now what's going on? Lottie walked slowly to her room and returned with the story box. She held it out for Lewis and told him the whole story breathlessly. The box, Umber, the tree, the night room, poor Rabbit, the night king, oblivion. Then with real excitement, she opened the lid and took out one smooth and shiny cherry seed. What do you think? He always absolutely believed Lottie. He leaned over the box and looked in. Something had happened to her. That was certain, but it could have been a dream, he said. It was not a dream, Lottie said firmly. It's kind of like school today, isn't it? When I had to write on the blackboard different ways to understand the same thing, or not understand, Lottie said impatiently, I remembered everything again. It had to be magic. Are you sure you didn't dream a wild dream after the crazy food you ate last night? Lewis pressed as Lottie frowned. Or it could be that your father made a sort of kind of hypnotic box that creates, visions, three-dimensional holograms, makes you see things. It's probably some sort of mind trick. But the cherry seed, Lewis, it's real. She held it out to Lewis. He hesitated, then placed the strange pebble in the story box and took the seed. They were the same size. He rolled the seed in his hand and held it up to the light. He shrugged and Lottie took the seed back. Lewis took his pebble. Let's try to get in, Lottie's eyes sparkled. Now, Lewis asked. Of course now. Lottie always meant now. Maybe he built the secret compartments in here somehow, Lewis suggested. They leaned together, looking deep into the glowing cherry wood for some kind of secret. Memories flooding their minds as they peered in. They wondered what might be unlocked if they found their way inside somehow. And they fell through. That's the end for today. Thank you so much for joining me.